I think that's also about self-advocacy, whether you're going through an experience like this or your child is going through an experience like this. Nobody is a better advocate for you or your child than you.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the We're Not Stumped podcast. I'm your host, Mike Bolland, and today I welcome Allison Sweet Grant. Allison is a writer. She's been published in the New York Times and the Atlantic, and she holds a dual master's degree from the University of Michigan. Now, Allison's written a book called I Am the Cage, and it's getting a lot of attention. It'll be released on February 18th, which is today, but it has already received a lot of great feedback during its pre-release. And we're going to get into that today and a little bit more, hopefully, with Allison. But the first thing I just want to say is, Allison, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for having me. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you.
Well, I'm honored because I want to learn so much more about what you have written about and everything you're talking about, some of your own experiences. But we always start the podcast with a segment I call In Your Own Words. So I'd like the listeners to learn a little bit more about you.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I'll start by saying I'm honored to be here to talk about my debut novel, I Am the Cage, which is about a young girl who undergoes a complicated orthopedic procedure to correct a congenital limb discrepancy and the ways in which it affects her as she approaches adulthood. It's a very deep story, an emotional story, and it touches upon heavy themes of medical consent, childhood trauma, but it's also about resilience and self-discovery and personal growth. The novel is fiction, but it's based upon my personal experience growing up with the same diagnosis and the same treatment as an adolescent.
And what was that? What would you call your diagnosis? I'm not sure if I'm familiar with it.
So I was born with something called congenital short femur and fibular hemimelia, which basically translates to having one leg shorter than the other. And that's sort of what got me into this situation to begin with. I underwent a procedure known as the Lizarov procedure, which is a limb lengthening procedure that involves a external fixator device. It's a metal device that is attached to the bone. The bone is then cut, and then the device expands sort of like a telescope to lengthen the leg. And then new bone grows into the space. And so the limbs are then essentially equal in length after the procedure is all completed.
And that's the parallel between Elisabeth, who is the character in I Am the Cage, and yourself to a certain extent.
Absolutely.
And as you were growing up, how did that, just to maybe make it a little bit more personal on your side, then we'll talk about the book as well. What was that like growing up and having to go through these types of procedures?
Well, it was definitely challenging. I was 11 years old when I underwent this procedure. Elisabeth in the book was also 11. And it was hard because adolescence, particularly puberty, right, is a time where most kids are wanting to become more independent. You know, they focus less on the family, and friendships become the center of the universe. This was hard for me because self-reliance was something that sort of went out the window once I had this procedure. I became dependent on everybody around me for pretty much everything from ambulation to ADLs and, everything in between. And it was definitely a lonely and isolating experience in a lot of ways. It really shaped a lot of who I was as a teenager. It's one of the reasons that I wrote this book was, I didn't have anything. I, I I I felt very, very alone in my own experience, and I wish I had had something to refer to in terms of somebody having been there before. And that's what I wanted to give people in this book, in this fictionalization. I wanted to let them know that somebody has been there before, right? And I imagine that's something that is salient to a lot of your audience members.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I want to remind everyone we're talking with Allison Sweet Grant, who came out with a book coming out today, actually February 18th, called I Am the Cage. One of the things I wanted to ask too, how do you feel the children and young adults in the healthcare system can maintain their autonomy over their own bodies? How does that work? And what's your feeling on that?
I think it comes down to honesty. I think that we as adults want to protect our children, right? And sometimes we don't give them all of the information because we think it's scary, right? Or it's uncomfortable for us. But it's so important to tell kids about what is going to happen to their bodies before these things happen to their bodies, right? I think that's also about self-advocacy, whether you're going through an experience like this or your child is going through an experience like this. Nobody is a better advocate than for you or your child than you. And I think little things like asking for permission, right? Like before a healthcare provider touches a patient, especially a child, right? These little things that maybe we don't think about but are so important. They're small acts of generosity that we can give to patients, that we can give to children, that really help them maintain a sense of control over what's happening to them and a sense of trust for those providing their care.
Yeah, I went through that myself, certainly with my parents and being born congenital limb difference without a hand. So I think exactly what you said is very poignant. Do you have any advice, though, for people that maybe are in the early stages of their own journey, whether it be maybe a parent or it might be harder for a child? But if you want to chime in on that, I'd love to learn a little bit more of your perspectives on both of those fronts.
I think my advice, would actually be to ask as many questions as possible, right? And that's not anything, like, revolutionary, but so often, like, we forget that our our providers are working for us, right? And we get to ask as many questions as we want about what's going to happen to us, and this sort of goes back to self-advocacy as well, right? Yeah. I think that would be my biggest piece of advice, for somebody starting out, in this kind of journey.
Well, you say it's not revolutionary, but I'll tell you what, it does come up a lot on this podcast. And I appreciate you bringing that up because I think there's times where we all forget that, hey, we're the squeaky wheel and we have, as you said, we have some say into what we're going through ourselves. And we need to ask the questions. So I'm really glad you brought that up. How does it feel to have the feedback that you're getting for the book already? It's got to feel great.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you. It's been incredible. I've received a lot of unexpected encouragement and support. There are so many people who did not know that this was something that I had experienced because I didn't grow up with them. And really, after I had this major surgical procedure, this major intervention, my disability became an invisible disability in a lot of ways. So people who didn't know me as a teenager may not have known that this was something that I went through. And the reaction has been incredible, not just to the book, but to putting myself out there in a way that seemed a little bit scary at first, and still does in in many ways. Um, but the feedback, as you said, that I've gotten has been just really lovely and, really reassuring.
I read that you were originally going to write directly about your own experiences. Of course, I know that the experiences in with Elizabeth are very similar to yours. But when you go back, what was the aha moment for you to go, I need to write this book. I want to write this book. What was the impetus? What was the motivation for you?
Hmm. That's a really great question. And I don't know if I really have a perfect answer. I've always been a writer. I know we mentioned this before, but I've always been a writer, but I always wrote just for myself. It wasn't something that I ever wanted to share with anybody else, and it wasn't something that I ever tried to share with anybody else. It was just for me. And this story, Elisabeth's story, I had written in a piecemeal way, sort of like journal entries over a very long period of time. Really during COVID, when my children were home from school, my son was in kindergarten trying to learn kindergarten math and kindergarten linguistics over the computer, and I was sitting next to him all day long. I had this opportunity to really start pulling things together. And I don't know if there was an impetus. I don't know if there was a catalyst for it. But once I got going, it came out of me in a way that was very organic and felt very necessary. And I just felt like this was a story I needed to put down on paper.
One
I
of
don't
those
know if
things.
that makes sense.
It actually does. It almost seems like once you started, you knew you were on a mission to get it done.
Yeah, it felt like a story that I just needed to tell, and it started with my story, but I knew that it couldn't end that way. I knew that these characters had to have their own path, their own dreams, their own desires, their own goals, and um, I wanted to give that to them the best that I could.
One of the characters that I read about, you were fortunate to have a friend like this. Kacey is one that I see that a lot of people are writing about, and someone that may have been a friend to Elisabeth, if that's a fair way to say it. Is that based on someone that was real in your life as you were growing up?
Yes, Kacey, the character of Kacey is based on a friend that I had growing up. Um, Really the only friend that I had who stuck with me through this procedure. I did lose a lot of friends, unfortunately. Middle school is tough, you know? And I was taken out of school for a long period of time while I was sort of going through the thick of it, through the surgery and then the immediate recovery. And then when I went back to school, it was hard. There was a lot of teasing. There were a lot of glances in the hallway. I mean, this is to be expected, I guess, unfortunately, in a middle school environment. But yeah, Kacey is really I can't remember who I told. Somebody asked me about Kacey not too long ago, and I said, Casey's really like the hero of the story. Not only is she, sort of the best friend that everybody needs, but she's also, um, I don't know, she's also the reason well, I don't wanna give too much away,
Yeah, you definitely don't want to do
right?
that. And
Yeah.
actually, though, what I'll say to that is, I think your book and with what you're doing and the story you're telling, you're going to be the hero of someone else's story. And I think
Oh.
that's paying it forward is very important. So congratulations on that. And gosh, good job plowing through and getting a book done. I'm sure that that's a whole nother podcast to talk about how difficult that probably is.
Oh my gosh, well, that's so kind of you. I'm just so delighted. This story has been in my heart and on my mind for so long, and I'm just so thrilled to see it come to fruition and, just delighted to be speaking with people like you about the story, so
Well, I'm
thank you.
honored.
Yeah.
So since I'm unfamiliar with what you went through to a certain extent as a child, I was curious before your procedure, did you had a leg shorter? Was it very much noticeable? And how did that affect your schooling and the people that you hung around with at the time?
It was noticeable. I had a approximately 3-inch difference, which required a permanent lift to be attached to the bottom of my shoe, before this procedure was done. So from infancy to around age 11, I wore a lift. And, it was a challenge, the same way as any other difference for a kid, right? I always struggled, in gym class, right? I always
Yeah.
sat out in gym class, to be perfectly honest, right? And then kids would ask, like, "Why are you sitting out in in gym class?" It was hard. I mean, I I think that I thought once I was done with the procedure and once my legs were even, um, that I wouldn't struggle with any type of physical difference because of the corrective procedure, but that's not the case. A procedure like this, is traumatic physically, and although my legs are close to the same length now, um, they certainly don't function the same way, so I can't run, at least not well. Um, I couldn't go for, like, an hour hike somewhere because my bones and muscles and, uh ligaments don't react in the same way that my healthy leg does. So, even though my legs are the same length, and if I'm standing still, you might not notice that I have a difference. I'm still limited in some of the physical activities that I can do. So it's something that it's a lifelong learning process, right? And it's a lifelong challenge. And when I went through the procedure, that happened to be like um, the most challenging aspect of my experience with this, but it wasn't the only one. It wasn't a short-term, correction. It's something that I've had to deal with my whole life.
It's like a lifetime, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
a lifelong experience. And
It's
I
a lifelong
certainly
experience.
from my perspective, I agree. But yeah, that's very interesting. And the parallels between Elizabeth and yourself, we may have talked about it before, but is there anything I'm missing from that? Is it just it's I know it's really based on personal experience, but is there more to it that I may not know?
I don't think there's more to it. Like I said, Elizabeth is her own person, her own character, and although she's based upon my experience, the book is fiction. There are things that happen in the book that are unique to the book. Yeah, I drew upon my own experience in writing about Elizabeth's experience, but the 2 are not one and the same.
And as you look to your future, now you have a book out and you've been published in other major publications, what are you looking forward to in the future?
Oh my goodness. Well, I don't know. Right now, it's sort of hard to see past all of this.
A lot of stuff
Like I
going
s
on right now, huh?
Yeah,
Yeah.
lots of stuff going on, but like I said, I'm just so excited to be putting it out there. It means so much to me. It was so meaningful for me to write this book, and I hope that it brings meaning to anybody who reads it.
I think it will. Again, we're with the Allison Sweet Grant, and when your book is released, where's it gonna be available so people know where to get it?
I hope it'll be available everywhere, wherever
That's
books are sold.
no, obviously like Amazon and other.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
absolutely. So go to Amazon. Everybody's listening to this. Go to Amazon and look up "I Am the Cage" because it's going to be a great book. And I'm excited for what you got going in the future. I think it's fantastic that you took the time to write a story like this because there's families that are going through the same thing that you went through. And we had a little pre-conversation, and you really said something that struck with me. Maybe while you were growing up, some of the things that are available to young families and children, they weren't available to you at the time, and they are now. What does that mean for you?
It just makes me really happy, actually. This was a very, a very difficult time in my life, and, I know this is something that, lots of people still go through, and it's a wonderful procedure, right? Because it helps so many people, but at the same time, there are aspects of it that are really challenging, and so I hope that my book just, helps somebody to get through it a little bit more a little bit easier, and I hope that, people are really able to focus on the emotional experience, not just the physical experience when you go through a surgery like this or an intervention like this, but really, like I said, the entire person, person-centered care, holistic care, and making sure that we pay attention not just to the physical aspects, but the emotional aspects of someone's journey as well. And I hope this
Yeah,
contributes to that.
that is so important. I'm glad you brought that up. But I'll tell you what, I think this is going to be a resource moving forward as well. People are going to read this and understand from a different perspective what you went through. And if they have a child going through that, they're going to learn quite a bit from you. Where can people learn more about you?
I do have a website. It's AllisonSweetGrant.com. You can also go to penguinteen.com. And both of those are great resources to learn more about the book.
Fantastic. I'll make sure I link those in the description. But for people that are listening, go to those two resources and learn more about Allison. I just want to thank you so much for taking your time to be on the We're Not Stumped podcast. And I know that this is going to do a lot of great things. So congratulations on the book. And I can't wait to see what else you're going to be doing in the future.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this conversation and for being such a great host. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the We're Not Stumped podcast. If you'd like to be a guest on the We're Not Stumped podcast, please go to we'renotstumped.com and fill out the form. But if nothing else, please like, share, and subscribe. But if you're going to do one of those three, please share it. There's so many people out there that need to hear these stories, the great stories of the incredible people that are on this podcast. So do me a favor, please like, share, or subscribe. Thank you.